take both paths to change the mindset, unfreeze the mindset, as you put it, but also start nudging people toward those behavioral habits.
Hi, I'm Matt Egol, host of the CX and Culture Connection, the podcast for leaders looking to drive impact by focusing on their customer experience and culture together. I'm really excited to be here today with Dr. Ben Granger, who is the Chief Workplace Psychologist at Qualtrics. Thanks for coming on the pod, Ben.
Thanks for having me, Matt. I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. I have to say, I really enjoyed your book, A Leader Worth Following. Enjoyed doing a review of that and having you now on the podcast to talk about it. And you saw in my review, I see this book as really a strong book in a collection of things that I've looked at that I address what I call leadership experience. I'd love to hear how you think about it and what led you to write it and what you're seeing. But for me, this really fits in with a number of other things that I've talked about with other guests recently, like Jerry Zaltman from Harvard, and Simon Robinson and Bernie Jaworski and others that we'll talk about. But it's a really timely and relevant book, I think, especially with what's going on in AI,
Yeah,
which is actually raising the stakes for good leadership.
right. Totally agree. And might I say, I really enjoyed your review. And ever since that one came out, I've been reading your book reviews. I've just put a plug for you, Matt. Very just outstanding. I love the connection with the other things that you're talking about and thinking about. I really enjoy. It's one of my favorite reviews of my book that I've read, for what it's worth. So I really enjoyed it.
Well,
Um,
that's nice of you to say. And I found your book. I think it's going to be thought of like the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. That's what I was
mm,
thinking about, like by Stephen Covey when I was reading this. This is a book that every leader should read to think about how to improve themselves, because that's a core theme of Seven
that's
Habits is
right.
start with yourself and what you can
Right.
control. And that really jumped out at me in your book is the way you influence others is by focusing first on yourself.
I think it has to be that way. And to go back to kind of your opening, Matt, I did think this was really timely. I have to be honest, though. I mean, I never really intended to write this book. If I go back to the genesis of it, where it really started, zero intention of writing a book. What I got interested in, this was about 4.5 years ago now, was I got just really interested because we were studying AI and what was going on with organizations, and I was doing a lot of reading at the time, a lot of different fields. As you saw in my book, I touch on a lot of different fields of science. But I was doing a lot of reading, and one of the areas I got very interested in is, hey, we at Qualtrics have all this data on how companies operate over time, how well they are, how well they do financially. We have a lot of data on how well they do from the perspective of their customers. We have a lot of data on how they do from the perspective of employees. And I was just very curious, if we look at all this data, sort of a meta analysis of our own research, what is it about companies that just consistently create good employee experiences, create good customer experiences, and drive strong financial outcomes? What is it about those companies that's different than the rest? And so started diving into the research. It didn't take very long before the initial answer was leadership. There's something different about the way those elite companies lead. There's something different about the way those leaders show up, how they communicate. And so we started looking at all that data. And then that started making connections, much like you do in your book reviews, started making connections with these other topics I was reading in neuroscience and evolutionary psychology and even physics, and how these as analogies to things that are happening in organizations. And one of the things that I see happening is that as we are watching AI completely disrupt the way that organizations operate, and sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way, it is very clear to me that the amount of change, the pace of that change, and the degree of uncertainty that we are all facing now in the work world is on average dramatically more than it was 10 years ago, which is dramatically more than it was 20 years ago and 30 years ago and 50 years ago and 100 years ago and even further back. And so we're now in a space where things are moving much, much faster than they ever have. And so that started to connect these dots. Okay, there's something different about leadership, but how is this all going to play out in an AI augmented world? That's really the question that ignited me to want to write this book.
Yeah, it's 100%. I think what really another thing that really jumped out at me, Ben, is the way you make the connection between EX and CX stronger. And it's not just a data connection about the linkage, like happy employees equal happy customers. You really dive into how the leaders need to show up. And that's what's reinforcing that connection between the two. The leaders are creating the environment that they and the workers thrive in.
It's spot on. You pointed this out in your connection to the 7 habits. I firmly believe that all of this, what we're basically, when we're talking about organizations, we're talking about social institutions. We're talking about a group of people who's trying to work together to achieve a human mission. It's always about meeting the needs of other people. So when we're talking about organizational dynamics, we're talking about a group of people trying to meet the needs of other people. And within those groups, you have hierarchies. That's always true. That's always been true about organizations. It's all universally true today and probably is always going to be true to some degree, even as we see agents come online. That's always going to be true. And so you can't divorce that. So we come to this question of, well, how do you get a group of people to work effectively together to meet the needs of other people? Well, you got to understand human psychology. You have to have people who are showing up in ways that demonstrate to others that they're actually living the things that they're preaching. Because, I mean, what's a great way to lose trust is to go tell people something and then go behind closed doors and do the opposite, right? You'll break trust right away. So those concepts, those psychological concepts like trust and reciprocity and social influence, all those different things that we use to drive human behavior show up. We have to be talking about these things. So I think it is essential, when we talk about good leadership and the leaders that, I make this dichotomy early in the book. There's generally, I think, two types of leaders. Leaders people follow because they have to, or they feel like they have to. They feel like they're stuck. They feel like those leaders have leverage over them. And then the leaders that we follow because we want to. And my general argument is that it's much better in a current world to be a leader that people want to follow because you're much more likely to get what you need out of them in an organic way. They're much more likely to perform better. They're much more likely to deliver for their customers. Those customers are much more likely to engage in reciprocal behaviors that benefit the group, our group, and that drives those financial outcomes. So I firmly believe, and I have a lot of data to support this because this has been a big part of my work, that those things all work together.
I mean, you were talking just now about the importance of trust, and you're also talking about like how the leaders are in an environment where change is a constant, where change is accelerating. So, what behaviors really distinguish the leaders that people choose to follow from those that they just comply with?
I think the first thing is that those leaders that we follow because we want to lead from the front. They are willing and able to get into the trenches. They have a certain degree of competence in what they're doing. All right. I think that's a really important point too. You can't lead from the front without competence. And so you have to work really hard. And I point that out in the book, right? This is not a quick fix type of book, right? It's not a, hey, do these quick tips and you're going to be a better leader. I don't believe in that crap. I really don't. And I use that word crap intentionally. I think
By
that's
the
what it
way,
is.
sorry to interrupt you, but I have a fun play on the word crap with my partner, Randall Rothenberg at JourneySpark. We like to spell crap CRAIP. And so,
Ah,
and then and that's said to be distinguished from creativity, which is also spelled with CREAI, tivity. Crap instead of slop. I like it. We like it better because it reinforces the AI could be either crap or creative depending on the way you use it.
yes. I agree with this, by the way. I don't view AI as good or bad. I think it all depends on how we use it,
Mhm.
just like every other technology.
So
It's a
you have
good, I like that.
creativity versus crap. It's like that's at
Yeah,
the core. The way the leaders can actually create an environment that reinforces open mindedness, that reinforces collaboration, that actually leads to creativity. And AI can be a partner in that if you use it the right way.
100%. 100%. And we see a lot of people doing it really well. And some not doing it well at all because they're leaning too much on it. They're offloading their thought work, for example. They're bypassing communication to use it. Um, and I think back to the point, the it has to start with the hard work leading from the front. The specific behaviors too that we notice, like in that back going back to the research that spurred this whole foray into the book was we saw leaders the one of the biggest differences that we've seen consistently between elite companies that deliver good employee experience, deliver good customer experience, deliver financial performance. Those are high trust leaders. Okay, so that's first and foremost. So, what does that mean? What does a high trust or a trustworthy leader look like? Well, I really like and we use this model in our measurement of consumer and employee trust of Davis, Shorman, and Mayer. And and this was a model that's been validated all the way back in the mid 90s in the context of business. And it asked people to evaluate leaders from three different lenses. Do you view your leaders as competent? Can they do the job? Two, do they have integrity? Will they do the job? Do they do what they say they're going to do? And so here you see themes of consistency. Are they reliable? Are they consistent in their behavior and their words? And then the third lens we ask people to look through is benevolence. And that's basically the implied motive. And it's from the perspective of the other, the follower here. Do I think that those leaders are making decisions that are going to benefit us as a group? Or are they making decisions that are only geared to benefit them? That is, of course, driven by their actual behavior, but I think it's also driven by their communication and how they communicate. And this is something we also so back to this question. Leaders we follow because we want to are high trust leaders. They're competent. They do what they say they're going to do. They're consistent in what they say. And they do make mistakes, by the way. But when they make mistakes, we tend to forgive them because when they make decisions, we perceive that they're trying to do the best for the collective. They're trying to do things that benefit all of us and benefit our customers versus being self focused. Within that, we see high communication leaders. These are leaders who communicate frequently, they communicate through stories. They communicate things that get us inspired. Like I want to run through the wall whenever I hear our CEO talk or something like that. That's the sort of thing you might hear from a high trust or a leader we follow because we want to. And again, they lead from the front. They're willing to get in down and dirty into the dirtiest jobs. They're not above those things. They're not leading from the ivory tower. They're not leading from the back, doing exactly the opposite, and they have the competence and integrity to do that.
When they do that, they exhibit the behaviors. When you can actually see them and doing the things that you're asking others to do and and modeling the behaviors. Some of them, like in the case of, Disney, I had Len Milbauser on, like, but basically he talked about if a leader's not willing to pick up trash, why do you expect the employees to do it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I'm going to take this a slightly different direction you may not be expecting, but you use the phrase benevolent leader. And what you made me think of was a discussion I had when I had Bernie Jaworski, who's the Drucker chair at the Claremont Drucker School. And so he literally sits in the chair that Drucker sat in, right? Big seat to fill, right? But he's a fantastic guy. I had him on the podcast twice because he's had two different books I've reviewed. But the first one he wrote was about building the organization of the future, which he collaborated on with one of his PhD students, And it was a comparison of Drucker and Confucius, which was, I had not expected that.
Interesting.
That, like, I had the same reaction you just did with your facial expression. Like, why are Drucker and Confucius the same, like, body of thought? But they were both about benevolent leadership, and
Mm,
how a leader actually is building an organization that people feel connected to and have a shared purpose.
yes.
And their different principles of building benevolent leadership is a fascinating comparison. But Drucker at his heart was as much of a psychologist and philosopher as a business person, very much a humanist and multidisciplinary. And a lot of what Bernie focuses on is purpose driven organizations and how leaders can do
Right.
that. And his second book is The Soul of Strategy, which actually talks about making strategy more human and putting the customer at the center of the strategy, which is really what Drucker was about customer
Mhm.
centricity.
I love that. I'm a huge fan of Peter Drucker, and I'm very attracted to those connections that, with Confucius, I would have never thought about that. But that I'm very attracted to books and stories like that that take these two seemingly disparate ideas from totally different fields and bring them together. I'm a big fan of that.
Too. I
Um,
love those surprise connections. Yeah.
I do too. It's kind of the same thing that happens in our brain when we find something funny, right? Yeah, that you take these two neurons that were really far away from each other and they suddenly smash together and it delights us. I love that. But I
The
also
unexpected reversal. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. But I also really appreciate that point about, so I touch on this a little bit in my work, but I looked at it was coming at it from an evolutionary perspective. And so I got really interested in this subfield of evolutionary psychology, which even though I've been a psychologist ever since basically I was an undergrad. I went all the way through in psychology from a bachelor's, never changed my major, all the way through to a doctorate. And I didn't even know this subfield of psychology existed called evolutionary psychology. And what it essentially looks at is what was going on many thousands of years ago in the social environment that made us the way that we are today. Why do we do what we do today? What are the evolutionary roots? What were the social and the environmental pressures that our ancestors were under that affect the way that we think and we behave today? And so, what became, and that took me into anthropology and evolutionary biology. And what got me really interested in is, well, what was the history of leadership? How is modern leadership different from what it was in the past? How are groups of people different than they were in the past? Are they different? And what I kind of came to that's aligned with what you're saying is groups of people, we've always lived in groups, right? Groups of people have always existed. And within those groups, always exists some degree of a social hierarchy, social status, a social status striving. But beyond just the status striving, humans have some universal motives. So if you kind of align that evolutionary psychology focus with human motivation, go back to Maslow's hierarchy, David McClellan, DC and Ryan, any of the general motivation theories, you'll find pretty consistent universal finding that people want to be a part of the groups. They want to feel like they belong to the parts of the groups that they are part of. They want to contribute to those groups. They want to be valued and they want to add value to the group, right? Pointing back to that concept of benevolence. And we even the most introverted of us are social. Humans are a social species. We've survived by working together in groups and and
This
talking
is
to each other.
this is a huge part of cultural norms, and that there are subcultures in an organization. One of the people I learned a ton from was John Katzenbach, he wrote The Wisdom of Teams and like 20 other books. And he was the founder of Katzenbach Partners. He left McKinsey to form Katzenbach Partners and then sold Katzenbach Partners to Booz.
Mm,
So fun story is I was actually a new partner the year that happened. and he went to the partner orientation because he would just want to be one of the people. So this was the guy who was the led the New York office of McKinsey, was the head of their culture and their change management practice, formed his own culture boutique, sold his firm, which had 7 partners at the time. So difference in scale, like 250 partners, 7 partners. Sold it to Booz because he thought it was a better cultural fit than going back to McKinsey. We had this whole practice on organization DNA, and he thought it was a really good fit with our changing culture. So he went to the partner orientations like, "Hey, I'm Katz, just one of the new partners." I'm like, I knew who he was. I was like, and I ended up doing a lot of work with him and other people in that team. So it was incredible learning experience to work on culture with thought leaders in culture. But what I took away from that is people are motivated to be proud of themselves and want others to be proud of them, right? And so if you're buy into the purpose of an organization, you see what peers do, that you copy your peers that you admire, you copy leaders you admire, you want them to feel, proud of you. And this motivates people. It's not just self-gain and economics, the
Right.
peer learning and the kind of sense of intrinsic motivation are super important in cultures.
100%. I mean, I love that example because I define culture as basically the shared behavior patterns among a group of people. I think that's my favorite definition of culture. And you pointed this out earlier on too, that the leader's behavior is a big part of that, right? When you look at social influence levers, how do you get a group of people to do something or behave in a certain way? People appeal to authority. Not everybody in all situations, but generally speaking, people appeal to authority. When they're uncertain, they look at what other people, what are everybody else doing? And as uncomfortable it is to suggest, we are very influenced by the environments we're in. And so this is one of the reasons why I think leaders mastering themselves first is so critical because it's such an important, observable, highly observable artifact that represents how should I behave as an employee.
Often make distinction in cultural change efforts between 3 types of employees in an
Mm,
organization: the leaders, the frozen middle, and the front line.
mm,
And the leaders is generally like not just the C level and their direct reports, but usually goes out to like 100 to 500 people, depending on the size of the organization, maybe up to 1,000 people. It's a really big organization that have a lot of influence over other people. And if you said, let's get the top leaders of the company together, it may be between like 100 and 500 people, depending on the size of the
right.
organization. The frozen middle, I didn't create that phrase, but I love it. It came around like 15, 20 years ago, is that the middle managers often are frozen and their energy is trapped. It's just like it's wasted, and they kind of wait out change. They're
Yes.
constantly
That's a good
waiting
way to put it.
and they're just frozen. And culture's about energy and the flow of energy. So you want to unfreeze the middle, right?
Mm, mhm.
Um, and culture change that unfreezes the middle is enormously powerful. Who unfreezes the middle? It tends to be leaders that the middle wants to follow, right?
Wow, that's a good
you
point.
know, and
Yes.
and then the front line, the middle manages the front line. The front line often can change a culture, but it usually needs the middle and often the leaders as a catalyst. So I like to start often with the leaders and then think about how can they help engage the frozen middle and the front line, and often starting with their own behavior. So one of the things, I've been collaborating on with James Killian and Simon Robinson. I mentioned my review of your book and some of the other ones you've read. We're collaborating on something called the Leadership Experience Accelerator, the LX Accelerator. Um, let's run a quick sizzle reel about the LX Accelerator, and then we'll come back on the other side. Allow me to interrupt the podcast to share more about an exciting opportunity I'm working on with my friends James and Simon, the LX Accelerator. The LX Accelerator helps leaders close the gap between intention and how teams show up, focusing on opportunities like AI adoption and the linkage between CX and brand promise.
To understand more about how your leadership team can close the intention gap and scale behavioral change, we invite you to take our free cultural assessment on our website.
And we're really looking forward to sharing feedback from this diagnostic tool with you as part of a free debriefing session for those of you who complete it. It's a really valuable first step in your LX Accelerator journey and a great opportunity to learn more about the program and especially our unique customer centricity strategy framework and other tools that we'll be sharing with you.
We're really looking forward to the free debrief session for those who take the online diagnostic. Now, let's get back to the podcast. Ben, I've really been enjoying our conversation about a leader worth following. We just did the sizzle reel of what I'm collaborating on with James and Simon, and you actually worked with James. He used to
Yeah,
be
good friend of mine.
at Qualtrics, and he speaks very highly of you. And I told him I was having you on the podcast. He was very excited.
Yeah, well, he's a great friend of mine. I think very highly of him too.
Yeah, and he has a book coming out, The Customer Driven
Yes,
Leader,
that's right.
and one of the things people can do in the LX assessment that we just ran the reel for is they can actually get a sense of what type of leader profiles they have in the organization. Like, are people customer avoidant, customer tolerant, customer centric, or customer driven? That's James introduced that framework. And you can get a sense of how just, where's your center of gravity in your organization, and there are different behaviors you can engage in to be more customer driven. And you can also, another thing that we teamed on, kind of the chocolate and peanut butter together, his customer driven assessment. And I have a cultural assessment that we combine with his that you can see, is your center of gravity more better, faster, or cheaper in the organization? And there's often
Mm,
tensions, so
mhm.
the behaviors of the
Yep.
leader may be skewed to better, faster, or cheaper. And often the organization wants to strengthen one of them, like we're better and we want to become faster. We're cheaper and we want to become faster. Doesn't mean they go 100% in the other direction, but it's about the right balance. And if you understand those tensions, you can actually help get the leaders together to talk about how are their behaviors reinforcing the norms, and what are the 3 to 6 behaviors they want to focus on as leaders together to drive change into the organization.
Mm, I love that. By the way, as a little aside, James and I, because I'm well aware of his book, he and I have done a bunch of conversations about that, including his podcast. And we were joking that we should just join forces and do a customer driven leader worth following. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah.
but uh, but yeah, I love that. I love those concepts too, because I do think one of the things I spent a lot of time, and this was a big aha for me, honestly, was how critical the environment that leaders create is. And you talked about this with starting at the top and before we came back from the break, starting at the top, influencing those leaders to influence and unfreeze the frozen middle, to then unfreeze that cascading down of those behaviors. I'm a big fan of focusing on the environment. How do you shape an environment? And then again, a good question would be, well, what is the environment? What is that? And I think a big part of it, as I mentioned earlier, is the behaviors that people observe. What do people see leaders doing? And what do they not see leaders doing? What's absent? I'm a big fan of Edgar Schein, rest in peace. Edward Hall. I like to combine their two concepts of culture in that, Shine talked about this cultural iceberg. If you're trying to build culture, you have these visible artifacts at the top, just like the top of the iceberg that we notice. But he points out most of the iceberg is below the surface of the ocean. And just below the surface are the values of the company, and below that are the underlying beliefs. And I like that visual, combining Edward Hall's concept with Shine's visual, because I think that a lot of, at least for me, I'll speak for myself. I would focus a lot on changing those beliefs of the leadership team. How do we evolve those beliefs? How do we then, how does that turn into values that you can espouse and you can rally around? And maybe that's, those 3 to 6 behaviors that you talked about, leaders aligning on what are those values that we align on. But I really think the action is in the artifacts. Because if we, again, remembering that we're a group of people trying to meet the needs of other people, those things have to be observable. And through my exploration in this book, I have a deeper appreciation, one, for the power of the environment and influencing people's behavior, but two, for this interaction where we often think of if we change our mind, then that'll change our behavior. But it works the other way too. If we change our behavior, it can also change our mindset. And
Mhm.
actually, sometimes I find it easier to force ourselves into behavior patterns, into habits. And I think there's a trick.
You're acting your way into new mindsets.
That's right.
Just like in advertising, people often said that it was a think, feel, do paradigm. That
Mm,
consideration leads to experience, and but you can actually have do, feel, think.
that's
And
right.
a lot of branding is actually experiential. That you learn about it and experience it, and then you rationalize it later. So it's actually do, feel, think, and you're acting your way into a new mindset. The same thing happens in cultural behaviors. Like it's much harder to change a mindset, actually.
I
Uh,
agree.
and what's fascinating is so much of change management, and this doesn't mean this is not important, but it oversimplifies it and misses something. A lot of change management. So, what does it mean to do a culturally sensitive approach to change management? Well,
Mm,
change management often focuses on communications,
hmm.
and it focuses on um, unfreezing the mindsets and getting people to buy in and make a mental shift to some change that's needed, and then to commit to it. And then you communicate and cascade out the communications and enroll others. The problem with this is that unless you actually change the behavior, it doesn't actually change. And so when things fail, it's often because you unfreeze the mindset, but don't invest the time in changing the behavior. And then the mindset shifts back. It doesn't last. So it's not enough on its own. Like, so a good inspirational speech or motivational speaker or doing a consulting project and get everyone around the table and talking about the fact base, that doesn't actually drive change unless the leadership behaviors change.
I totally agree with this. I think I do think all those change management activities you talked about are important. And what I don't think we're saying for those listening is to stop doing those things. I think what we are saying, and I'm hearing this and what you're saying, Matt, is you do both. You take both paths. Because imagine if we just started nudging people. I like that concept of nudging, right? We started nudging people in certain behaviors through incentives, through maybe unconscious nudges, through any sort of choice architecture decisions that the leaders are making to nudge people toward those behaviors. If we don't accompany that with the rationale, some people are going to be like, well, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? And that's not a good state for people to be in, because when people are starting to question, like, why are we doing this? What are we doing this for? Why did we suddenly change these behavior patterns? Why am I being asked to
Well,
do this?
also,
No rationale.
it's gonna feel really manipulative and inauthentic.
Exactly. Exactly. That's exactly where I was going with that, Matt. I mean, people start to question motives, and that becomes a lack of benevolence or perceived lack of benevolence. So I think what I'm hearing and what you're saying, Matt, which I firmly agree with, is take both paths. Take both paths to change the mindset, unfreeze the mindset, as you put it, but also start nudging people toward those behavioral habits.
Totally. To bring it back to AI a little bit more, many organizations are investing heavily in AI and technology, but not enough in preparing leaders for the behavioral and cultural changes those technologies require. Why do leadership development and org transformation so often become disconnected?
This has been, I think, one of the most frustrating things I've dealt with as a consultant is the pure lack of enablement that leaders get whenever they become leaders. It's still discussed today. I mean, I still talk to clients all the time when we talk about their development programs, especially their leadership programs, where, they're selecting, they're promoting, they're hiring for what I would call traditional hard skills. And then they come into these leadership programs and they get very, very little training on things like communication. They get zero training on things like body language, which I think are incredibly important. Devote a whole chapter to that. They they're and then they're expected to then become, oh, you were a great individual contributor, so now you're going to be a good manager. Those skills that make somebody a really good individual contributor don't always translate into being a good people leader. And I think this is going to be heightened in this world of AI because now let me kind of put a positive spin on this. I think one of the really good things that AI is encouraging us to do is it's really encouraging us to take a good look at what is it really good at and what is it not good at, and what can we do as humans that make us uniquely valuable in the organization. And I think so far the answer is it's those things that we would traditionally call soft skills. So influence, communication, those are the things that AI isn't all that great at, and maybe will never be all that great at because it can tactically do a lot of the same things we do. But there are some things that it can never be. For
Yeah.
example, be an inspiring human.
So you're, one of the senior leaders at Qualtrics, and I should mention to the audience that I used to lead the Qualtrics practice at PwC. So I've done a lot with Qualtrics over the years and continue to do things since founding JourneySpark. What are some of the ways that you apply these learnings in the work that you're involved in at the XM Institute and the client work at Qualtrics?
We would regularly do research on what is it? I think the big research question we're always after is what are those specific things that organizations do systematically that create good employee experiences, that downstream create good customer experiences, that downstream create good business outcomes. That is the chief question that we go into our research with, whether it's direct or indirect. And so we basically always apply this. And the reason for example, to take it back to the book, the reason I wrote the book was not because I wanted to be a expert in leadership. I had no intention of that. Still have no intention of that, to be honest. What it was where's the data pointing? That's why I wrote it. So we apply this, and I would also say genuine curiosity to what is it? Is that changing, right? Is what makes a good organization from an employee, from a consumer, from a business, from a financial standpoint? Does that evolve over time or does it stay the same? So that genuine curiosity, does it stay the same in this age of AI? Is it going to be different in 2030 and 2035? So that genuine curiosity. But I would also say what we also try to do, to your question, is as we're learning about these behavioral patterns among leaders, as we're learning about communication norms among elite organizations, we really do try to partner with our other executives in the business, like our chief people officer, like our head of customer experience, to try to evolve the way that we do it internally. Because back to the whole point, how can we go out and evangelize experience management if we don't first practice it internally? Same thing as the same point about leaders mastering themselves.
Yeah, I think there's enormous opportunity to leverage platforms like Qualtrics to deepen insights and operationalize the application of leadership behaviors. I can give an
Mm,
example if you're um, interested, which is I'm going to connect the kind of CX, the brand purpose, the purpose, the kind of the brand promise, and leadership behaviors and emotion, how they all go together. So if you understand the brand and what like there's a brand and CX are two sides of a coin because
right.
you have to deliver CX that's congruent with the brand promise. If you don't deliver one, your brand will not be successful. It's not, a brand is not just logo and identity and words. It's delivered through the experience. So if you understand so a brand that's imbued with purpose is going to be more emotionally resonant, but not to customers and to the employees. But you can also then think about, well, how do you deliver that brand promise? If your brand is reliable and friendly, for example, then how do you deliver reliable and friendly? Right? That can be through human to human interactions or through digital interactions. And the human to human interactions are human behaviors, employee
Mhm.
behaviors. That a lot of the peaks in the customer journey are actually because of employee behaviors that deliver those
That's
emotional
exactly what we
peaks.
find. Yeah.
Yeah. And now, so once you know all this, you know the brand, you know you got a leadership alignment on the behaviors you want to live the brand, both directly and indirectly.
Mhm.
Directly is like your front line with customers, indirectly is the experiences you collaborate on designing, right? Um, and you can actually reinforce those behaviors and see whether they're showing up in your customer listening.
Mhm.
And by the way, it turns out that once you know the emotions you want and the behaviors that deliver them, there's an 80% statistical correlation between emotion and business outcomes.
Yeah,
And
very
that's
strong.
double the correlation of NPS with business outcomes, is having the right emotions.
That's exactly what we find. We find that the emotion that is generated on the consumer side is a much, much stronger driver of their attitudes and their future behaviors than are things like the ease of the interaction or the seamlessness of the interaction. Not to say that ease and seamlessness are not important; they are, but emotion is a stronger driver, as you're pointing out. And what our data also supports is what drives emotion: person to person interactions.
Well, a lot of what people do, Ben, with digital can reinforce a strong emotional connection. But unfortunately, a lot of what people are doing with AI and digital today is just draining pain and getting to middle. They're
Mm,
not actually getting to an emotional peak. They're incrementally chipping away at pain. So I think that can have
mm,
value. There's a cost
interesting.
of quality. But if all you ever do is spend years of effort to remove pain, what you end up with is an average. You don't end up with a peak. You're reducing
Mm,
the trough to the middle, not reinforcing the peak. So they're both, again, like we said in change management, both are important. It's good to get rid of effort and friction, but if you never create those emotional peaks, you don't have a strong brand.
this is such a good point, Matt. We look at the same issue from a slightly different angle. We're doing some future of experience management research right now. We're getting ready to publish it in a few months, but we're basically projecting out what is this whole field going to look like? What are the ways that leaders are going to need to be looking at experiences that they create for their consumers and employees differently as AI becomes more commonplace? And one of the things that we are recognizing is that business executives are saying, hey, the seamless digital experiences, really quick ones, those ones that you're saying will relieve some pain, but only bring you to the middle, they expect those to be completely table stakes by 2030. And so what it also does is if that's all we do is let's make this more efficient. Let's fix this. I think it does a few things. One, to your point, it brings you to the middle. You don't get that high peak that you need, via the peak end rule that we know so well that drives human behavior. But we also find that that is not going to differentiate companies at all. How can you differentiate if that's what everybody's doing? AI is going to make that much easier for companies to do. The second thing it's going to force people to do, and this has been a big theme in our consumer research, is consumers start to question the motive. You're moving toward efficiency. I used to be able to talk to a human in this interaction. Now I can't. What's the motive? Is this for me? No, I don't think so. That's what a lot of consumers are saying.
Yeah. So if we were having this conversation 5 years from now, what do you hope, or three, things are changing so rapidly.
Yeah.
Maybe I should say three and not 5 years, right? If we're having this conversation 3 years from now, what do you hope organizations will have fundamentally changed about the way they develop leaders?
I really hope we get to a point where we can at least balance what leaders do in terms of selection, promotion, and identification of leaders, right? The focus on the what, a balance on how did you do it? That's just something it seems so abundantly obvious to me that we should be doing that. And yet it's so rare to see a balance of the what and the how. There's too much focus on the what. There's a lot of unethical ways you can get to outcomes. I want to know how you got to them. So I hope we do that. I hope we also go back to the basics and have a really good understanding of the fact that we are a group of people trying to meet the needs of other people. And we cannot and must not bypass the all important communication, the verbal, the written communication that we've always engaged in. Well, at least I shouldn't say always, but at least for the last couple 100,000 years that have unleashed us as a species on this planet. That we go back to those basics, we go back to those campfire conversations, and we also lean into our nonverbal communication. As I pointed out, big part of what I think leaders have to show up differently. So I would like to come back, Matt, and see that every time the Fortune 500 promotes a leader, they go through communication education, they go through body language training, they go through training on rhetoric, just like they did in ancient Greece. I want to see those things come back. I want to see us really appreciate those uniquely human skills that only we can bring to the table.
I love it. So I really encourage everybody to, if you haven't yet, pick up a copy of the book, A Leader Worth Following. You'll get a ton out of it. I know it'll inspire some great ideas for you. It did for me. Thanks, Ben, for coming on the podcast. It was a lot of fun to chat over the last 45 minutes.
I enjoyed it. Thanks, Matt.
If folks want to get in touch with you, is LinkedIn the best way?
LinkedIn's a great place, and also create a little website that features the book. Benjamin, I'll help the folks out there. BenjaminGranger.com. We pronounce it Granger in Louisiana, as you correctly pronounced, Matt. But there's some cool stuff on there, including a companion playlist that accompanies the book. So if people want to kind of follow along and go through the scavenger hunt, it's also a good memory aid. So yeah, LinkedIn, BenjaminGranger.com, both are great places.
Fantastic. Thanks again.